Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kathleen Stevens, and I want to welcome you to KEI. I think we have a very timely topic today, maybe more timely than we would have thought when we came up with the idea. Shifting the burden, the USKorea Alliance amid Washington's new approach to military cost sharing. I know this is a topic that's gotten a lot of attention in Korea. It's gotten an increasing amount in Washington and in the US, I think in recent weeks. Just 2 weeks ago, November 21st, the editorial board of the New York Times, which my generation called the paper of record, had an editorial with the title, "Trump's Lose-Lose Proposition in Korea. His exorbitant demands on the South alienate yet another ally in a dangerous region." I don't recall seeing an op-ed like or an editorial like that in recent years, but certainly increased attention to it. We have not just a timely topic, but a really very distinguished and perfect group of experts to discuss it. Hi. You don't need to hear what I have to say. I want to welcome all of you. We have a former ambassador to the Republic of Korea, Tom Hubbard here, Skip Sharp, former commander of U.S. Forces Korea, and all those other hats will be here soon as well, and former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, also from Seoul. So we're and I see many distinguished friends and colleagues here. I do want to thank, before I introduce our keynote speaker, the Korea Foundation for their support for this. This was an initiative of our fellow and director of academic affairs at KEI, Kyle Ferrier, who has been researching and writing on this topic, as well as many other topics related to U.S.-Korean relations for some time. And I think you were prescient's probably too strong a word. We kind of knew this was coming, but I think it's, as I said, quite timely. And I am really pleased that we were able to persuade former Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Republic of Korea, and if I may say, a great friend and colleague of mine, Minister Sung Min-soon, to come back again to Washington. We were talking, when you're a former diplomat, you're used to getting on planes all the time. We're very grateful that you're here. Minister Sung's bio is in the program you received. I just want to highlight, of course, that he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade from 2006 to 2008. He was previously the National Security Advisor in the Nomuhyun Blue House, and had a really extraordinary diplomatic career as a Korean diplomat. U.S.-Korea relations and issues related to the Korean Peninsula and North Korea were interwoven throughout his career. I'm not going to repeat it all. But in terms of major negotiations, the successful completion of the first Status of Forces agreement between the U.S. and Korea in the 1990s, 1991, and then he was called back to do the second SOFA negotiations, which he may tell us lasted a bit longer in the 1999 to 2000s. So deeply immersed in building the alliance, building the relationship, as well as, of course, being the chief negotiator in the six-party talks on the North Korean nuclear issue in the mid-2000s, which is when I first met him, and achieving what I still think is a high mark in a difficult process, and that is the Joint Statement of Principles of September 2005, and the work together that Minister Sung did with his American and other colleagues. He's also been a National Assembly member and remains very involved in all things diplomatic U.S.-Korea and North Korean relations. And he was also the president of the University of North Korean Studies in Seoul until 2017. He was just telling me he finished his memoir a few years ago, and I confess I haven't read it yet, but it's either going to test my Korean or I'm going to have to find someone to help me translate it. He was telling me it's called A Glacier Moves. Maybe we'll have to get you back to talk about that before we change the title to A Glacier Melts. But we're very glad to have you here to speak to us, and I want to welcome also General Sharp, who's just come in, and others from this delegation. So without wasting more time with my words, I again want to welcome Minister Sung and ask him to speak to us.
Thank you, Ambassador Kelly Stevens, for your kind introduction of my background. But actually, my background is not as splendid as you introduced, just humble. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. General Sharp, General Chung, and all Ambassador Hubbard, and Katie, well, and Korean Embassy colleagues, and those who are Jim Priestop, Mr. Costello. Well, there are so many people whom I have been talking to for last many decades and who helped me a lot for me in navigating through this, building our strong bilateral relationship between Seoul and Washington. Well, actually, as Ambassador Stevens introduced, I was the negotiator on the topics we are going to discuss today, but today I'm very much free because I'm now standing as a commentator, not as a doer. Well, actually, I borrowed this word from Tony Blair some years ago when he just stepped down from the Prime Minister's office. And I asked him, what's the big difference while you are in Downing 10 and out of it? He said that, I am now a commentator. I'm free to talk. Well, on my way here, I'm reminded of an episode. It's almost 30 years ago. It was in Honolulu, Waikiki Beach. But my meeting with then American negotiator was Carl Ford, the Pentagon. We were sitting at a small round table hall in that hotel in the midnight because we did not want to reveal Seoul and Washington was talking so seriously about the money in the public. So even a larger official meeting, we did not talk about these money matters. We talked about other good things for alliance. For last 30 years, it changed so much. Yeah. Now is this topic of cost sharing and burden sharing is the talks of street. Everybody talks about. It changes so much. I really feel the vicissitude of the alliance. But even in this tumultuous era, we need to gather some wisdom. And those who in this room care so much about alliance have to have some productive discussion here and there. And your views, I think, is very important for the future course. Today, I first like to talk about the threat perception. In my experience, when the threat perception changes, everything related to the alliance and alliance management change. This cost sharing, and I heard yesterday there was a conference here on the operational control transfer, and some the late discussion on the GSOMIA between Seoul and Tokyo. All these things are falling within this purview of threat perception. With this in mind, when we look around, there has been an unprecedented change of the threat perception in and around the Korean Peninsula. But it fluctuates, this threat perception, on and off, it fluctuates. But lately, last couple of weeks, this threat perception raised a lot because of this salvo of verbal threats between Seoul and between Washington and Pyongyang. When we near the so-called Kim Jong-un's deadline for new paths by the end of this year. But before that, for example, President Moon Jae-in stated in political sense that war was over on the Korean Peninsula after he met Kim Jong-un last year, April actually. Since then, he seems to believe that it is feasible to peacefully coexist with a nuclear-armed North Korea for an undefined period. I metaphorized that situation like coming into a tunnel with a bomb without the end of sight, without the end of the tunnel in sight. Thus, President Moon tried to declare formally the end of the Korean War, even though Kim Jong-un declared that North Korea had deployable nuclear bombs. So I thought it is an irony. When North Korea declared I had bomb, and then South Korea said that, okay, war is over. What an irony. And this confuses actually the threat perception, particularly in South Korea. As for Donald Trump, he continues to boast about the exchange of beautiful letters with Kim Jong-un. To me, his game with Kim Jong-un looked like a charade. You don't know what the others are thinking. How can you make a negotiated solution under that situation? But the problem for South Korea is that he did not take North Korea's potential nuclear threat to South Korea seriously as long as the bomb could not reach the United States. Furthermore, he takes a position as if the alliance networks in Asia and in Europe be disposable overnight. We are seeing a lot of controversies in London these days about this alliance network in NATO. And I see a lot of analogy both in Europe and in Asia. But many knowledgeable people, including those who are in this room, know that beneath the flurry of the rhetorics and the theatrics shown by these political leaders, the real threat remains unchanged or even heightened on the Korean Peninsula. However, these political acts of leaders have made a chunk of Korean populace lesser concerned about its national security than before. Against this chaotic backdrop, the basic factors that make up the fabric of alliance are changing. When we say alliance, firstly, the common objective of the alliance. On the Korean Peninsula, Korea-US alliance objective is to deter the threat from North Korea or elsewhere. But people now doubt about where is the threat when the war is over. When American president and North Korean leaders start exchanging beautiful letters between them. And the second one is the cost sharing. For the alliance, the cost sharing should be fair. But at least one side does not think it is fair now. That is the problem of today. And third factor is an expected reward. We expected the reward of this alliance is peace and stability on and around the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. But now people think, probably many of Korean populace think that this peace and stability is taken for granted. So these three pillars of alliance are in shaky form. We are talking about this cost sharing against this backdrop. I think this confusion of threat perception is caused largely by domestic politics. In Washington, in Seoul, and when we talk about Jisomia and other problems leading to that chaos, in Tokyo as well. I don't know whether it is politically correct or not, but I am reminded of an American official some decades ago, if my memory is correct, John Foster Dulles or Alan Dulles, one of these brothers, said that foreign policy is illegitimate child of domestic politics. I was warned of these remarks by my daughter, Daddy, you should not say that. That is not politically correct in this era. But I'm talking about 5 decades ago, he said. So this phenomena complicates management of alliance more than complex than ever before. On balance, a paradigm shift in the Asian security landscape is evolving, particularly because the United States behaves as if it can or have to depart from Asia. If that is the case, it would leave the Asian security more to the hands of Asians, as Chinese President Xi Jinping has repeatedly emphasized. The Asian security should be left to the Asians. That's what he wanted. But I think President Trump might be making President Xi Jinping more comfortable by showing some signs that the United States may leave. I think a graver concern is that the present complexity of the alliance network may not be resolved to any significant degree even after the Trump administration. That is really great concern, at least to me, to observers like me. With this background in mind, let me turn to the issue of this defense burden and cost sharing. As I said, I was one of the architects of Korea-US, the first Korea-US special measure agreement. You know that why we call it a special measure. According to the 1957 SOFA agreement, United States was to shoulder all the cost for stationing American forces, except the areas and existing facilities on the Korean peninsula, on Korean territory at that time. But we had to make a special measure, an exception to the Article 5 of the SOFA. So we called it special measure. Rather than, actually the exact meaning was exceptional measure to the SOFA agreement. If I can introduce myself, I was known to the people in Korean in the government that Song Min-sun was Mr. SOFA. Because since 1957, first they concluded this agreement, there were two divisions twice, one in 1990 and the other one in 2000. At these two divisions, I was the chief negotiator. So in 2000, in the second revision, I negotiated with, you may know, the Fred Smith at the Pentagon. And at the conclusion of this, on the signing ceremony, I told, now ROK US SOFA became comfortable to sit on. SOFA should be comfortable, not like the stools like. But it became uncomfortable now already because of this cost sharing agreement. Special measure is just in the framework of the SOFA. but I feel guilty. I declared so far became comfortable, but now already it doesn't look so comfortable. So I'm standing here. Actually, the underlying guideline of this SMA at that time was that ROK would start to shoulder some portion of the locally incurred cost for American forces, while the United States would bear the rest, including expenses for troops, equipment, and other military operation and management. The two sides, and the Seoul and Washington at the time, had expectation that ROK could gradually increase its share to eventually cover most of the local expenses. In fact, since that first SMA, the ROK's burden has increased 6 times, reaching roughly, to my calculation, up to 70% of the USFK's local expenses when areas and facilities and locally augmented manpower cost included. During this period, Korea's GDP increased about 5 times. So this increase in the SMA burden is a little higher than, but United States, Mr. President Trump wants it's much, much higher than that. In the middle of this incremental approach, to reach a solid burden sharing structure means the expenses for sending country and expenses for host country divided. The Trump administration is asking for I would better say that a prohibitive amount of money for keeping American forces in Korea. The monetary size of the demand and the way it is being made seem to be blatantly overriding the basic principle of cost sharing between the two countries and the time-honored spirit of the alliance. Above all, if pursued, this demand would seriously degrade the identity of American forces in Korea. In that case, they would no longer enjoy the respect of the average Korean people. I think General Sharp, other military personnel who had General Chung, you know that how much the American forces are enjoying the respect of the Korean people. But once the identity of the American forces are degraded, then they cannot enjoy the respect. When you do not enjoy the respect of the receiving country's people, what would happen then? What should we do then? Now I'm saying as a commentator, not a negotiator. In my view, the key to the problem is whether the two sides can agree on a firm guideline that locally incurred cost will be borne by the host nation and the other cost by the sending nation. This should be firm. And the next task will be about how to appropriately categorize the cost involved. First, we have to undertake a highly professional and technical consultation on the cost requirements of the USFK and to periodically estimate them in advance and balance the account afterward. This kind of procedures are needed. I think probably the negotiation that happened in this town in the other days, last couple of days, must be talking about this. I don't know how much seriously they are talking. If they are negotiating on rational basis, they should do this. But I don't know whether American negotiators are under the behest of President Trump's request, just one-sided insistence that would not be helpful anyhow. I think any political gestures, including those statements by American officials insinuating a troop withdrawal or Korean civil groups' anti-troop campaigns, are not helpful. So I have to say that there is a saying that good fences make good neighbors. Likewise, good categorization of the cost. Yes, you have the reason to laugh. Good categorization of cost will make a good alliance. I think that's the key. If these efforts were to fail, the alliance itself would be brought into question. As I said, when the troops cannot enjoy the respect of the receiving country, their problem lies. This concern is more serious than before because the discrepancy between the threat perception and the real threat, which I described earlier. For example, the chairman of the United States Joint Chief of Staff recently quoted Americans saying that, why does the US protect rich countries? Actually, it was surprising for me to hear that kind of saying, not from politicians, but from a top American general. If he was someone else, it is okay. But how come a top American general can say that? Why we have to protect you, rich country? That's nothing I expected earlier. On the other hand, some segments of the Korean people ask, why do we need such an expensive foreign troops when the war is over? These are some conflicts happening. I think if these whys, why we protect rich country, why we need this expensive foreign troops, these two whys continue to collide, what kind of consequence can we expect? I think now is the time for us to be reminded of the truth. The United States protects its allies based on mutual interest and mutually agreed conditions. The United States cannot protect its allies in ways it designs alone. At the same time, the Republic of Korea cannot expect American protection in ways it wishes alone. Well, this is all mutual things. In case we fail to solve the problem, I think the most likely consequence would be the United States allies, more like in East Asia, Korea and Japan, in Europe, France and Germany and others, will resort to their own ways and means to protect themselves. These allies would know that they cannot continue to buy their safety with money. Instead, they would secure their own defense capabilities. As we see the symptom in the NATO conference, we saw that some key NATO countries, Germany and France, they want to have their own nuclear forces combined. Let's think about when German defense minister announced that Germany is going to raise its defense spending from 1.36 to 2 point in 2031. When Germany increases its defense spending almost twice, what would happen? I'm reminded of the saying that the NATO Secretary General in 1957, that the purpose of NATO was Russians out, Americans in, and Germans down. We have to think about this saying more than almost 6 decades ago. And then we have to draw the similar analogy in Asia as well. We can simply change the country's name from that NATO formula in Asia. We know that Korea and Japan, in particular, are surrounded by nuclear-armed potential adversaries. It would be no wonder that they would want to be equipped with their own security umbrellas. In the case of the Republic of Korea, if USFK are drawn down or the possibility looms, the move for a nuclear option will get a strong support among those who think that South Korea cannot live in peace with a nuclear-armed North Korea. Simple. United States is not, I'm not going to say United States, I will better say that President Trump and his people are saying that if you do not pay enough, we may have to leave. And then Koreans think that, okay, when umbrella is gone, from whom can you get that umbrella? Can you get it from Russia or China? The answer is that we have to make umbrella of our own. If that were to happen, undoubtedly it would further weaken the NPT regime, which I think is already in shaky shape, really in shaky shape. Actually, when we have witnessed President Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un without a tangible progress in denuclearization, it gave Kim an undue international standing. It gave dangerous signals to other nuclear wannabes to say a fait accompli strategy for nuclear wannabes. Actually, what I said now is nothing new or provocative to the audience in this room. I am sure that most of the concerned officials and intellectuals in the United States know those aspects I just emphasized. They understand better than I do. I'm certain that at least in this room you understand better than I do. But I would like to know what is the median view of the American voters on this matter, and how would President Trump and the people around him respond to that view? Let me touch briefly on the future of the alliance. I personally hope that the present chaotic security landscape in and around the Korean Peninsula will not result in a drastic change in the ROK-US alliance. Still, the momentum of significant change is on the horizon. I think the likelihood of the change will depend upon, first, whether we can effectively work on a joint security assessment. I don't know whether Seoul and Washington have now full joint security assessments shared by them. And secondly, agree on a mutually acceptable burden sharing structure the form structure I described. And thirdly, that is smooth transfer of the military operational control. We have many factors, but these three factors are, I think, are very important. To borrow Friedrich Hegel's words, I foresee a transition from changes in quantity to changes in quality. We have to gather our wisdom and energy to manage the transition to a desirable direction in a stable manner. I did not propose a concrete solution, but I put forward some problems. But I am very much pleased to share with you some of my thoughts today on those subjects. Thank you very much for your listening.
For a really, I think you'll agree, profound and wise overview. I hope the panel will answer some of those questions, or at least address them. Perhaps if you would, if there are questions, we don't have a lot of time, but maybe we can take like 2 and you can have some comments on them, but then we'll continue on through the afternoon. Hope you'll be able to contribute more. So I see lady with the laugh. Right, you can introduce yourself, sorry.
I think you had enough reason when you laughed.
Yes, if I got your joke, I think it was funny. Rachel Oswald, reporter with Congressional Quarterly. You mentioned earlier that even when President Trump is no longer in office, that you think some kind of damage will still be done. Can you talk about why that damage is separate from President Trump, and how worse will the damage be if he serves for another full term, or if there's a change in occupancy?
Well, I think I'm not going to talk about the domestic politics of the United States. But when we look back at the election 3 years ago, at that time, to my view, actually the views of the Trump and Hillary Clinton, though there was not much big quality difference, just a difference in style. For example, the then candidate Hillary Clinton also he just objected to TPP. He emphasized more burden sharing and some containment policy, all these things. So what I'm concerned about is the trend, even though it is to me a little sad, but the trend is that even after Trump will continue. But I hope that those who are having a rational thought, rational thinking, should how to moderate, how to regulate the speed of the change. And I think this is not my own view, the view generally shared by some Asian people. And I lately had the chance to talk to some South Asian people and ASEAN country people also. So Americans are not seen so much these days in Asia. That causes problem. I don't know whether my answer is good or
Maybe one more, very quickly, yes.
Thank you. I'm a reporter from Voice of America Korean Service. My name is Dong-Yeon Kim. One thing is, you mentioned about a post-Trump and still it won't be dissolved. And I interview a lot of people who's actually backing the burden sharing issue on Trump's agenda. One of the key issue is, so America is not fully enough for containing the rising threat against China or Russia. So the alliance has to contribute more. And the thing is, actually, those people who support Trump policy is, he's a catalyst. Because we put high price, it actually makes the alliance value how the United States has contributed until now. And they always address about the free riding issue and the previous president free riding issue of the alliance. And I think this rationale is very strong on the Washington D.C. Itself. Although there's some people who actually values alliance, there's a difference that there is a problem in free riding of the alliance. So how can you address those rationale of the conservative who supports these idea that alliance should have much more burden sharing?
Well, I don't know whether I quote exactly your question, but this burden sharing, I think we have to divide this cost sharing and burden sharing. There's some nuanced difference. When the allies of the United States in Asia, likewise in Europe, enhances their defense capability, it is actually a burden sharing. When there is total security threat burden, there should be shared by allies. I think this cost sharing is largely money matters. Just cost is bearing the American forces cost by the host nations. But when the host nation, not as host nation, but as allies, it enhances its defense capabilities. It has a more larger dimensional difference. Likewise, as I explained, for example, if Germany is going to be rearmed, what would happen then? And likewise, in Asia, from American points of view, some frontline countries, I don't know whether this frontline country is the right definition, but if I can describe in that way, the frontline countries in West Pacific Rim enhances their defense. Defense means military capabilities. What would happen then? Then we are going to reversing the history 70 or 80 years ago. That should be taken care of. That should be considered by American people. So if we can solve this problem in this, to the extent of the monetary consideration, that would be okay. But those host nations don't like to buy their safety with money. They like to secure their own security with their own military capability. I think there lies the dilemma.
All right, please join me in thanking Minister Song. We're going to transition to our panel now. It's terrific, really terrific. Thank you so much. So,
sit here?
no, you can sit here if you like, but pitch in anytime you want. We're going to give you a comfortable, not sofa, but chair. As they get settled, I'm now transitioning to moderating this panel. We have such a rich pool of talent here today for our program. I'm going to give, in the interest of time, very truncated introductions. The somewhat fuller biographies of our panelists are in your program. But today we have with us General Skip Sharp, Walter Sharp, who is a career Army officer. We served together from 2008 to 2011. General Sharp was the commander of U.S. Forces Korea, UNC. There's all the hats I should have to this, and CFC as well. And we were great colleagues, and he remains a great friend of the alliance. And he is now president and chairman of the Korea Defense Veterans Association, and follows all things Korean very closely. We're very pleased to have here with us Scott Harold, who's a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. He is a specialist in the foreign defense policies of China, Japan, North and South Korea, and Taiwan, and also is a faculty member at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. Kyle Ferrier, I briefly introduced earlier, our fellow and director of academic affairs and research here at KEI. Kyle and I travel to a lot of universities together, but he finds time to write papers too, which is more than I do. And finally, James Kim, last but not least, a senior research fellow at the American Politics and Policy Program at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. And we're looking to him to give, well, everyone, but to give us a further perspective on Korean attitudes. So with that, I'm going to kind of open up by asking each of our panelists to make some short opening remarks. I've kind of teed it up with a couple of questions, but feel free not to answer them. But General Sharp, of course, as I mentioned, you and I served together in Korea. We were there during, I think it was the 8th SMA negotiations, right? I think it was. And it was a difficult negotiation, but nothing like now. And it did result in South Korea increasing its contributions. At that time, I think it was about 2.5%. But my question for you is more broader. I mean, from your perspective, not only in Korea, but for your long military experience, and reflecting on some of the things that Minister Song said, how should the ROK and the U.S. calculate burden sharing? And what types of costs and supports should and should not be included for each side?
Thanks, Kathy. And first off, thank you and KEI for inviting me and those that are here from the Korea Defense Veterans Association and the Korea-U.S. Alliance Foundation for attending this meeting here. Just give a 30-second advertisement for Korea Defense Veterans Association and Korea-U.S. Alliance Foundation. We are organizations with one main goal, is to help strengthen the Republic of Korea-U.S. Alliance. So we conduct programs, seminars, conferences, and do things to do that and to honor those who have served in Korea since the Korean War. And it's great to be part of all those organizations. But thank you very much I'm not sure if you asked me or ordered me. Whenever Kathy tells me to do something, I immediately do it. I thought, like those who have heard me talk before, I usually like to start to talk about facts, so we're all in the kind of the same basis line, and then I will give my thoughts to answer the questions on how burden sharing, how cost sharing should really be calculated. So just a couple quick facts, and looking out over the audience, I think probably every single one of you know most of these, but to briefly reiterate it, we have about 28,500 troops in Korea today. That's broken down to about 19,000 Army, 7,000 Air Force, and 2,000 Marines and Navy. The Army is there with one brigade that rotates from different parts of the United States, a combat brigade. We've got some artillery there. We've got some missile defense there, logistics units and headquarters units. The Air Force has 4 squadrons of F-16s there, and also some intelligence, surveillance, ISR assets that fly every single day over there. And the Marine Corps and the Navy have no units there. They got a small number of individuals there that would help when we went to war. So if you really look at the purpose of those troops that are over there, the ones that are physically on the peninsula day to day, I can break it down into a couple categories. The first is not necessarily the most important, but it is very important, but it's the first that we would execute, is non-combatant evacuation, NEOs. Our job is to be able to get the over 200,000 U.S. personnel that are on the peninsula to try to get them out of harm's way. And then the counter-fire fight, and that's done by both the artillery and the Air Force, missile defense, headquarters, logistics, and maintenance units. And then, very importantly, is the reception of U.S. troops that would come into Korea if we ever had to go to war over there. So that's what we have right now over there. If you look historically at how burden sharing has been decided and how people have added up the cost, my contention is we don't have a great spreadsheet. There has never been, to my knowledge, a great spreadsheet. I think a lot of it has been it started at this. We pushed for a little bit more. We talked about inflation, and it continued to kind of move up along those lines. I know when I was commander, I asked several times, show me how you calculate this 40%, and I get a whole bunch of different answers back along the board. So I don't think we have had, and I'll talk about what I think we have today in a minute, but I don't think we've had a great spreadsheet to be able to lay it out. But the intention is to pay for the non-personnel stationing costs. So how much extra does it cost? Not personnel-wise, but there's a little bit maybe that's figured in because of cost of living while you're living in Korea. But most of it gets around to maintaining the facilities, maintaining the equipment, and some of the training that happens actually on the peninsula for U.S. and South Korean troops, but for U.S. troops. So if you look historically, back to our time there, in 2008, it was about $723 million is what we agreed to at that time. It's gone up and down a little bit, but it's generally come up along the lines of inflation until recently. where 2017 it was 765, 2018 it was 830, 2019 it was 915. And at 915, I think you could argue, but I think where people are saying it's 45, 48% or something like that along the ways. And that pays for some of the contract costs, some of the military construction and maintenance facilities, and some of the service facilities or some of the services and maintenance that need to be made. I think one important point to point out about cost sharing and the money that South Korea has been giving to us, a large percentage that goes right back into the Korean contracts, right back into Korea contracts that do our maintenance facilities, right back into Camp Humphreys. A large part of the U.S., what the U.S. paid for Camp Humphreys really was turning some burden sharing money around, and that went back into Camp Humphreys for our share, our responsibility of that. That's across the board. So that's I think what has been done in the past. Again, just to summarize, it has been, I think, mostly based upon inflation, but some sense of, okay, it's about 50% of those non-personnel stationing costs. What I hear, and I'm not part of the administration, I read the same press you do and talk to a whole bunch of people like you all do in the room here. The current thought for the current round of negotiations is President Trump wants to expand the total formula, the spreadsheet, to include a whole bunch of other things. And again, I've just heard, without second, third hand, that he's also including in much more as far as the cost of exercises, both in Korea, in the United States to prepare units to go to Korea, more general exercise of costs around. I think he's pushing more for the personnel cost around. And so what, again, the 4.7 or the 5 billion includes a whole bunch of more costs that I believe are more indirectly connected with what the original intent of burden sharing was, to pay for the non-personnel stationing cost in Korea as you go through. So if a spreadsheet is going to be developed, and I think there is one now, I've heard the White House has a very extensive spreadsheet that they are using in the negotiations now. But if there is going to be a spreadsheet that adds all of these other factors, what I've been arguing for is that I think the counterside of that spreadsheet ought to also be there. And the counterside of the spreadsheet is what Korea has and is doing for the United States around the world. And I'll just quickly go through some of those. Military deployments, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, UN peacekeeping missions around the world. Korea sent the second largest number of troops to Iraq. Great as far as exports economically. They're our sixth or seventh trading partner. If you look at the defense budget, South Korea is our number one highest ally to pay as far as percentage of GDP. Their defense budget for 2020 is going to be somewhere around $43 billion with a 2.7, 2.8 of their GDP, which is higher than anybody else, any one of our other allies. They've said it's going to increase 7% for the next several years. So, they've got $29.5 billion worth of active cases that are open right now to buy U.S. defense equipment. They're buying F-35s, Global Hawks, Patriots. I mean, the list just goes on and on. So, in one hand, President Trump says, countries should be standing up to defend themselves. Well, South Korea is clearly doing that, much more than our other NATO allies and our other allies around the world. All that they're buying from us, that money does not just go back to Boeing or just go back to Lockheed Martin. There is a more foreign military sales kind of tax, if you will, that goes directly back to the U.S. government that's there. So again, I'm not advocating that this whole spreadsheet should include what I've heard the U.S. is including now. But if that's the road we're going down, the other side's got to be fairly, I think, laid out also. Once you lay all of that out, and I don't have the spreadsheet, but I think we're nowhere near the 5 times as to what is currently on the spreadsheet. A couple final points is I think it also needs to be considered that whatever increase happens, whether it's 2, 3, 4, or 5 times the amount, that money's coming from somewhere in the Korean government. I mean, the budget for 2020 is already in front of the National Assembly. It's coming from somewhere. And my guess is it would be coming from the defense budget. If it comes from the defense budget, that will directly relate back to how much Korea can spend on their own defense and how much they can spend on foreign military sales buying our stuff. So some of that, I think, also has to be weighed in as it goes forward. So in summary, I think that is how it's working right now. My personal recommendation is to have a spreadsheet, but the spreadsheet be narrowly focused on what is in Korea, what are the stationing costs, what are the training costs in Korea to have our troops, those 28,500. Because the last point I'll make is that when you go through all of this, I firmly believe, go back to Korea Defense Veterans model, the stronger Iraq-U.S. alliance, you don't give up the alliance for a couple dollars. The alliance has got to be the number one thing that we are thinking our way through. Because at the end of the day, North Korea will end up doing what North Korea does. China will end up doing what they're going to be doing. But the alliance has got to stay strong together. And I think the value of the alliance ought to somehow be included in this whole discussion about how much is it value of the alliance to the United States, the value of the alliance to Korea, how much of that is valued should be included in this whole discussion.
Terrific. Thank you, Skip. That's a great setup and scene setter. Scott, I'm going to turn to you now and ask you, given that as General Sharp and Minister Song made so clear, that clearly the current White House is trying to take a different approach to how we assess the costs of alliances and the burdens. Could you talk a little bit, kind of step back and talk about the strategic calculations behind basing American troops overseas? I think that's a question you hear from Americans generally sometimes. And maybe if there is any continuity between previous administrations and now, or if this really is a totally new approach.
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador Stevens. It's a real honor. Good to go. All right. Thank you, Ambassador Stevens. It's a real honor to share a stage with General Sharp, with yourself, to hear Minister Song, and then to have Kyle and my graduate school classmate, Dr. Kim. It's just a pleasure to be here. You asked about continuity. I think as we look back over the grand sweep of U.S. history and U.S. relations with Asia, a subject covered by Michael Green of CSIS and his magisterial book on the subject, you see that U.S. force posture in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific has evolved in relationship to the perceived interests, national security, values of the United States. Today, I think it's inarguable the United States is in the Indo-Pacific because it has security interests, because it has equities with economic relations, because that's where more and more of our people have ties to by history and family, and because that's where our values find a warm reception from countries that have democratized, built free markets, built free societies like the Republic of Korea, Japan, and other countries across Southeast Asia. My colleague Stacy Pettyjohn at RAND did a very exceptional study a few years ago looking at the specific dynamics of how the U.S. allocates forces across the region, and has noted that as threat perceptions and technologies have shifted, the U.S. has at the same time moved and repositioned its forces. We do have some elements of continuity in the Trump administration. There is a widespread recognition in, for example, the Indo-Pacific Security or Strategy Report, in the National Security Strategy, that the United States is in an era of great power competition, and our U.S. allies and like-minded partners are, quote-unquote, asymmetric advantages in meeting those challenges from a rising China or a revisionist Russia. On the other hand, there is clearly some divergence within the thinking of the administration, and I think that flows from the top, where the president has indicated he really wants money. He would like $4 billion more from Korea than it is currently paying. I think within the community of Korea watchers, this is largely characterized as being penny wise and pound foolish, words that General Sharp didn't say, but I think you could easily say For a $20 trillion economy like the United States, an additional $4 billion is almost nothing. For a $1.5 trillion economy like the Republic of Korea, roughly, it's also actually not that much. The question now, I think, is we're in a situation towards the end of this year and over the coming year where both sides recognize the amount of money symbolically is large for the Republic of Korea. It's about 10% of their defense budget. But it is not a large amount if you think that, boy, if we can just get through this year, maybe it won't be like that after 2021. On the other hand, if it sets a precedent for the Republic of Korea, that would be extremely damaging. It would also be extremely damaging from the perspective of many U.S. Asia watchers. It would not be damaging from the perspective of those in the United States who have argued the United States should retrench, should pull back, should let rich countries fight it out. Why should we defend rich countries? The ambassador, or the foreign minister said, some people in the United States are asking, why should we fight for rich countries? Well, would you rather have rich, powerful allies or weak, pathetic, dependent allies? I think the answer to that is quite clear. Which allies do we want? We want countries like the Republic of Korea that make major contributions, as General Sharp noted, to issues that we face around the world. The successor administration to the foreign ministers, the one the foreign minister served, worked to build a global Korea that built some of those relationships that you, General Sharp, and others built on the relationships that the foreign minister put in place to have Korea do things around the world and play a bigger role. And even today, under a relationship that is seeing a pretty strong divergence between a very different American president and a very progressive South Korean president, we nonetheless see South Korea articulating that its new South policy will be consistent with the free and open Indo-Pacific that the administration is pushing for. I think the other things that are consistent here are we have a consistent interaction effect between our alliances. So if the Republic of Korea burden sharing changes dramatically, it will set a precedent for Japan, which will be negotiating this issue next year. It will have an impact on the European situation with our NATO allies. That's not to say that we might not value South Korea investing more, but as General Sharp, I think, correctly notes, the pie doesn't expand just because you want more of it. You have to choose where you think you want to push your allies to allocate their resources, which are limited, even if they're large for a rich country like South Korea. They don't just have $4 billion more because you want them to. So you could either be robbing Peter to pay Paul, to stick with another reference to a kind of American idiom, to kind of take away from the ROK's defense budget to pay for U.S. forces. And that's quite controversial. So here I'd now pivot to what's new. We haven't talked much about the construction that South Korea has paid for the large consolidated basing at Pyeongtaek, but that's another form of contribution that needs to be recognized in that spreadsheet. I think the administration is talking about asking for South Korea to pay for flexible deterrent operations or strategic signaling. So when we fly B-52s or B-2s near the Korean peninsula to signal to North Korea that we have the ability to deliver on-demand strikes that are targeted against your leadership if you undertake any sort of a provocation, that's something the administration is now talking about perhaps wanting to be reimbursed for. But the community of those who look at the USFK and the broader US ROK alliance would argue on some level you risk turning the United States military from the patriotic soldiers, sailors, airmen, and airwomen and Marines who serve, who are welcome in Korea because they are there, because they're sacrificing time away from their friends, family, and putting their personal lives on the line, turning them into mercenaries who are there just to make a buck. That, I think, is a very big break, and it's probably one that is controversial even within the United States military community, to say nothing of the broader community of those who watch the U.S. and the ROK relationship. Just to close out then, I want to echo the foreign minister's remarks, and I think if there's anything that Korea can learn very well from Japan, one of the things might be when the Americans come to you with a demand that you're not very friendly towards, study it for a long time. Initiate a long program of research to delay that to death. It's a time-honored Washington, D.C. tactic, too. I'm sure we didn't only learn it from the Japanese. But this seems like a perfect opportunity to initiate an important year-long study. Perhaps our friends in the Congressional Research Service or the Government Accountability Office sitting in the audience might help with that. But that could easily be a study that would last some time and would provide the genuine facts that I think General Sharp is correct to say should honestly undergird it. I don't mean to sit here and say that we shouldn't be asking South Korea to contribute more to its security and its defense, and to be honestly a little bit more mindful of the fact that we need South Korea to play a role with our other alliances, including with Japan, but also with our allies across the Indo-Pacific and in the European theater, but also to bear in mind that South Korea, as a rich, powerful nation, does have equities in confronting the rise of China, perhaps not directly, but certainly helping contribute to the shaping of the environment in which China emerges. So I'll close there. I hope I haven't gone on too long, and I really look forward to the remarks of the other panels and your questions.
Terrific. That's perfect, Scott. Thank you. Kyle, you've written a paper for this event, which, hot off the press, is available to you here. And it's, I think, well, I won't try to describe it. You're going to describe it. But the U.S. Alliance amid this burden sharing challenge. And you do try to frame it, in a broader context. So why don't you say a few words about your paper and what you found?
Sure, Kathy. And before I get started, I want to thank you for moderating, thank our my fellow panelists for joining, especially James and Minister Song from coming all the way from Korea. I'm not sure if everyone purposely did this, but you've all teed up me quite well to talk about my paper, especially Minister Song talking about tangible outcomes and the shift from quantity to quality. These are sort of topics that I explore in the paper, essentially because this is essentially a security problem, but the shift that is undergirding it is essentially a political economy challenge. So that is really the jumping off point of the paper. And we've made a lot of comparisons between South Korea and other NATO allies and other allies in the region as it deals with dealing with the Trump factor and this new shifting change towards how we perceive the costs with the alliances. But I would argue that the shift is actually much broader, and it applies to not just alliances, it applies to everything from trade to the environment, and it's part of this same overarching architecture that has defined the Trump administration policy, which I define in the paper as trading the intangibles for the tangible. And this is to say that, under previous U.S. Governments since the end of World War II, presidents have adhered to bipartisan consensus that U.S. leadership overseas is worth financial, economic, monetary value to the United States, even though those areas necessarily aren't, in relating to trade or the economy, such as the military relationships that the U.S. built up over periods of time. And even though that they were hard to assign a dollar amount to, they were still upheld nevertheless. But Trump's break from this model is really his most defining foreign policy characteristic, and he is leveraging the structures of the liberal international order for short-term economic gains, as again, which I kind of define as intangibles, trading intangibles for tangibles. And what makes the SMA talks different this time around is because of this change in U.S. policy. And the intangible aspects of the relationship are things that we've talked about already. We've talked about deterrence, we've talked about assurance to South Korea in many different ways, but that's essentially what it all boils down to. And those are really the key intangible parts of the relationship. And what the tangible part is getting more money out of these SMA negotiations. As Scott rightly pointed out, compared to the broader context of what the relationship is, this is a small amount of money. But it's a lot easier to assign a dollar amount to. You see what this is. You see it's 1.5, excuse me, it's, we want $1 billion, we want $5 billion. South Korea is currently giving $1 billion. We want a $4 billion increase. But what you don't see is what that's tangibly doing to the other parts of the relationship. We talk about that in more abstract ways. We should include these things. This is what South Korea does. And I think General Sharp is right to sort of expand the spreadsheet. But as a thought process, I have expanded the spreadsheet even further by looking to what the quality aspects of the relationship are and finding ways in which, finding numbers that are existing out there that can kind of serve as a proxy to quantify what some of them are. And when you put the numbers to some of these qualitative aspects of the relationship, they are much bigger than what we're asking for right now. And so the first part of the paper looks at preventing a war on the peninsula, effectively a proxy for what effective deterrence provides the United States. It would cost the United States at least a couple of $1 trillion. Another aspect of the relationship is as Scott rightly mentioned out about South Korea's role as a partner in the region. South Korea helps the role with the United States and South Korea on the peninsula helps to secure U.S. foreign policy convergence on the peninsula as it relates to North Korea and China, as well as it helps to sort of amplify U.S. Objectives in the region through policies such as the New Southern Policy. And all of this taken together is worth much more to the United States than what we're currently seeking to do right now through the SMA negotiations. So all this is to say, essentially, it's an unequal trade. You're putting a lot more money on the table to get a little bit more money. You don't really know to put it in a gambling context, you don't really know what the odds are. We're not really sure there's a lot of uncertainty. We're not really sure what the future of the alliance holds, but by sort of taking the things that have held our two countries together for a while, I mean, there's more than just the military aspect of it for sure. But when you sort of disaggregate everything and then play off one another and sort of try to use long-standing norms to try and get short-term economic gains, it's sort of counterproductive because in the end, you're going to be losing a lot more money financially. And that's essentially the thrust of the argument.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. I think one thing that the Trump administration's policies have challenged us to do is to articulate, and in some ways, whether it's a spreadsheet or through words, things that we felt like we kind of instinctively knew, but to explain that and be rigorous about it. So I see that as something of a silver lining, if I can editorialize a bit. But I want to turn to James now to shift it back to some of the points that Minister Song referenced, but the mood in South Korea. I mean, it even reaches us here in Washington that there's a lot of noise around this issue of the SMA demands, as I think they're portrayed in South Korea. I think the Moon administration feels under quite a bit of pressure. But just give a sense of what the mood there is and what kind of challenges this poses for on the political scene in South Korea.
So thank you, Ambassador Stevens, and let me also thank KEI for organizing this with Korea Foundation. I think more so this year than last year, even though earlier part of this year and a lot of last year, there was a lot of focus on North Korea, it's interestingly enough. And then that focus has sort of shifted to a lot of these regional issues and alliance-related issues. Korea-Japan is another matter. But alliance management, it seems to be an issue that was discussed yesterday by KDVA, covered on OPCON transfer, and now on burden sharing. All of these issues kind of all converge, and it's overlapped with some of the internal domestic political developments in both the United States and South Korea. I find this quite interesting. So Minister Song kind of mentioned the importance of domestic politics in this, so I could perhaps shed some light on the South Korean, what's going on within South Korea, as you had asked me to cover. So one of the many hats I wear at ASEAN, aside from managing the DC office remotely with the help of Yumi, who's in the audience, is to manage our public opinion poll. And so, one of, as you know, the SMA negotiation, we're in an SMA negotiation this year, largely because the one that was negotiated earlier this year was a one-year deal. And it was finalized earlier this year, even though the deadline was supposed to be end of last year. Just goes to show you how difficult that negotiation was. And the asking price, based on some of the rumors that we're hearing from the Korean media, was less than half of what the current asking price is. somewhere closer to the full cost, maybe closer to $2 billion, is the rumor in Seoul. And so some people in Korea are saying, oh, we should have paid that amount last year for a multi-year deal, and we wouldn't have had to deal with this. So, but what's happened in the past is in the past, so you can't do anything about it. And so one of the things, and as the SMA negotiation was heating up, a lot of the issues that's being talked about right now was also raised at the end of last year and earlier part of this year. So we conducted a survey at the beginning of this year in January in coordination with Scott Snyder at CFR to take a look at what the Koreans thought about the USFK, the alliance, and also the SMA negotiations. And interestingly enough, the data it matches a lot of the more recent polling that's come out this month. In fact, I meant November. So about a week ago, or a week or two ago, there were a lot of Korean polling houses that asked similar questions that we asked earlier part of this year. And there was a lot of consistency in the results. We also are planning another round of poll on this issue, but we want to wait till this heats up even more, perhaps as we get towards the end of this year, and if it goes over time to beginning of next year. So we're waiting for the tension to go up even higher to see if we see any changes here. But the indications that we're getting from the November polling results are very similar to what we got in January of this year. In January, when we asked, whether or not, and if, to give you some context, at that point in time, all we knew was that the Americans were asking for more. It wasn't exactly clear how much more. When we asked whether or not the Koreans should pay more or contribute more to burden sharing, and in what way? Should we contribute? Should the South Korean contribution be exactly the same as what the Americans are asking, or should it be lesser than what the U.S. asking price is? Or should we maintain that level of contribution, or should we lower? And so when we asked this question, 46% of the survey respondents answered that South Korea should maintain its current level of contribution, not surprisingly. 30% answered that South Korea contribution should rise, but it should be lower than the level that the Americans are asking. 4%, mere 4% thought that South Korea should raise its contribution to match the U.S. asking price. 17% thought that South Korea should lower its contribution, and the don't know was about 3%. So if you look, the contribution should be moderate, if not maintained at the current level, is about altogether 76%. Interestingly enough, we don't see any differences across gender, ideology, age. This is pretty much consistent in all subcategories and different demographic categories. So what this suggests is that there's a general consensus about this issue across the board. The November results that came out that YTN just did, which we publicized in our biweekly newsletter that came out this week. This was surveyed on November 22nd. They asked the question a little bit differently. They asked what if we condition it based on the reduction of the U.S. forces? Now, no, it's not on withdrawal. Should South Korea contribute more, provided that U.S. is suggesting that they reduce troop presence on the Korean Peninsula? Remember that 4% I told you earlier about raising the contribution to the U.S. demand? That number, if you condition it on the reduction, goes up to 22%. So it's a significant increase, but it's not to the level that would change the dynamic here and how Koreans see this. 70% would oppose increasing any contribution, even if there's forced reduction. So it seems to me that, again, no difference across ideology, age, gender, other subcategories. So there's a general consensus here on both among the conservatives and the progressives that this issue they feel very strongly about, which is that an unreasonable ask, even if it results in a forced reduction, is not going to be acceptable politically. And this is really significant given that we're looking ahead into earlier part of next year, end of Q1. In April, we have a general election in the National Assembly. And both the conservatives and the progressives are concerned about these numbers, that these figures are not moving, even with increasing pressure. So, I mean, we'll wait and see if the tensions will change the calculus here. But overall, I think that the South Korean public has a fairly strong position on this. That's not going to change even with more pressure coming from Washington. I don't know. Do I have some more time to?
Can I just ask one thing? So you say your pressure, but you're talking about pressure from Washington. What about, and going back to Mr. Song's point, the threat perception from North Korea?
Right.
Is that something you look at in the polls?
So we did Mr. Song raised a really interesting issue about threat perception. And threat perception, we looked at in 2017 because there were all these tests that were happening all throughout that year. And, President Trump talking about fire and fury, and tension was very high. And so we wanted to know whether or not the, South Korean threat perception on this issue had changed, and if so, by how much. So threat perception was quite high in 2017, no doubt about it. It was a very different period than any others that we've seen, because the Americans were escalating at a level that we were not, the Koreans just were not familiar with. If anything, the U.S. would look to moderate and try to, lower tension. But here, the U.S. was leading the effort in raising tension. So you saw an across-the-board rise in this feeling that we may have a different situation here than what we're used to in the past. One really good indicator of this is President Trump's popularity in relation to other leaders in the region. He was below Xi Jinping until the end of the year. When tensions were high, he was not the most popular leader. And obviously things changed after 2018, and he was back on top starting towards the end of 2017, early 2018. So there's flexibility there on how Koreans perceive President Trump, depending on how the North Korean issue is managed, it seems. On the question that you raised about how would it, if we get a different situation next year where North Korea provocates without crossing the line that President Trump has said at no ICBM, no nuclear test. But North Korea, there are a bunch of things that they could do, right? And I'm sure General Sharp can mention some of them. One that we would be concerned with is a conventional provocation against South Korea or Japan. And if the U.S. doesn't respond, then it raises a whole slew of issues like, what does the alliance mean? And if this issue gets framed as a question of what does the alliance mean, and does the United States care? If that's how this issue is framed, I think the framing is going to go a long way in manipulating or somewhat shaping the Korean public's perspective on these issues. So if it gets framed as an alliance question about what the U.S. is willing to tolerate, does the U.S. care about its allies in the region, then clearly it would have a negative impact, right? But if it gets framed as an issue about what needs to be done to deter North Korea, and that U.S. is U.S. is providing the security guarantees that it should, then I think you may have some changes in perspectives about this issue. But I see very minor changes happening here. I mean, overall perception, the South Korean perception about the USFK and the alliance is very, very robust and very high. It hasn't really changed much since we've been polling this since 2012. And so I don't expect these numbers and these views about the SMA to change much. But there's a danger that if this is not managed correctly, the North Korean threat is not managed correctly, that it could backfire on a lot of these alliance-related issues, and SMA is one of them.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's terrific. I promised to leave plenty of time for this expert audience to have a chance to comment and question our panelists. I want to also encourage panelists, if they have questions or comments they want to make, that please intervene. But I thought I'd just kind of move back this way and turn to both maybe Scott and Kyle for a comment on a kind of broader regional question, which I know you both worked on, and again, which Minister Song mentioned in his keynote remarks. And Scott, I know in particular you wrote a recent report that looked at how U.S. allies are deepening their security cooperation in the region without, shocking, necessarily consulting the U.S. So could you tell us, what your findings were on that? In particular, South Korea's growing security ties in the Indo-Pacific and what that means for the U.S. And similarly, Kyle, if you have some comments about South Korea's role in the Indo-Pacific and this notion of maybe a more Asian defense. There also was a lot in the press, even including here. This is a kind of South Korea and Beijing taking a small step, but towards a kind of military, if you like, cooperation or communication.
Am I on again? Okay. Thanks, Kathy. An opportunity to talk about your research for a think tank or in front of a big audience is always welcome. Right, so I led a study that Rand did that just eventuated into publication earlier this fall on thickening cooperation in security ties among U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. So we looked at 7 countries: South Korea, Japan, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Australia. We started with 4 general hypotheses about why these countries might be increasing their defense ties with each other. Could be that they're worried about U.S. decline or commitment. It could be they're threatened by the rise of China. It could be issues associated with their identity, and this is very relevant for South Korea, a country that has developed, gained confidence in itself, built an enormous economy, and has something to contribute to the world, exemplified most notably by the notion of Korea as a global Korea that's going to do more in the region, do more around the world. And fourth, a factor that's associated with economic costs of defense. So as anyone who looks at defense industrial issues knows, the cost of systems grows and grows and grows. Korea has been a country that has been largely importing U.S. systems, but also has a very strong impetus to try to enhance its own autonomy by building its own defense industries. With a $40 billion a year defense budget, you can't develop your own systems. One example of this is the KFX, or advanced fighter, 5th generation fighter, or really 4.5 generation fighter that Korea is looking to co-develop with Indonesia. And so as Korea, for example, has started to try to do more in the region, I would say I don't think it's entirely apart from the United States. In fact, the United States has both encouraged this and in many cases been informed about it and offered thoughts about how we could support this. But for sure, some of the steps have not been taken with U.S. Advance warning or whatnot. The most clear example of that is the attempt or the threat to withdraw from the General Security of Military Intelligence Sharing Agreement with Japan. So we looked at 5 types of activities. Countries can set up 2+2 dialogues with their other security partners. They can export or transfer excess defense articles or even new defense articles. They can co-develop. They can engage in training and exercises. or they can do things like set up logistics agreements and intelligence sharing agreements. Korea is an exemplar of almost all of these. It has 2+2s. It has intelligence sharing agreements. In fact, it just signed one with another U.S. ally, Thailand. South Korea has exported light trainers and light attack fighters, ground attack fighters, to the Philippines. It has transferred excess defense articles to another U.S. ally, the Philippines. It doesn't do a lot in the training and exercise space, in part because with Japan, it's just not possible because of the relationship. The Australians, for example, say we routinely invite Korea, but the answer we get is often, we want to show up, but we really can't afford to pull any forces away from the deterrence of North Korea mission set. And then there are these logistics and intelligence sharing agreements. So Korea really exemplifies kind of all four of these. First and foremost, there is a desire to contribute more to the U.S. alliance and presence in the region by supporting and doing more with U.S. allies and partners. I think that's been stronger historically under conservative administrations. I have talked to very high-ranking current advisor to the current South Korean president who said that's all nonsense, we shouldn't do that. That individual is also on record recently as wondering aloud whether or not China would be a good allied replacement for the United States. There has also been a lot of emphasis on Korea's confidence and its ability to do more and play a bigger role. And I think that stems from the enormous example the Republic of Korea gives to the world as having risen from a lesser or least developed country to the 12th richest country in the world with enormous resources and the ability to contribute back. And then in some of the other spaces, I think it really has been an effort driven by the Blue House trying to encourage Korean defense firms to export their articles so as to reduce the per unit costs. In fact, if you talk to Korean defense firms, they usually say, we're not really interested in, first of all, they're not usually interested in defense because Korean firms, defense firms are usually part of gigantic Korean conglomerates and their first and foremost interest is we want to sell televisions and white goods and things that people use, not we want to sell things that blow up and get us a reputation for being merchants of death. Second, if they say, well, we have to do a defense role, they don't usually want to then have to tailor their defense articles to third countries that don't have the exact same needs as the ROK. So it's usually been the Blue House spurring this. But so those were some of the key findings that Korea really has contributed a lot, really does have a lot of reasons for expanding its defense cooperation with all allies and partners of the United States, including even Japan, where the relationship has been difficult. And I think that ultimately that may be why the Republic of Korea, which itself has received intelligence from the Japanese about the threat from North Korea, which itself has shared valuable intelligence with the Japanese, and to whom we said, you will make our security and the security of the forces that people like General Sharp have commanded on the Korean Peninsula be more exposed to the North Korean threat if you don't have this direct channel with Tokyo. I think those are some of the factors that have led Korea to say, you know what, there is value in these kinds of deepening ties. And so that's kind of what our finding was. Thank you.
Thank you. And my subsection in the paper where I cover this topic is largely based on your work, so I'm not going to go into it too much in terms of the security side, but to quote me, quoting you, something I thought was really interesting was when you talk about South Korea's defense exports are largely building up regional actors who may not be able to afford what the U.S. military is able to provide. So it's very complementary and not very competitive.
No, it is.
And then in another aspect, Seoul's arms sales and co-development with partners in Southeast Asia help undercut continuing Russian influence in the region while also representing an obstacle to Chinese efforts to build influence through arms sales. And so a lot of this necessarily isn't done with the explicit interest of building up the regional order, but it has the effect.
And I think you're really, Kyle, you said something earlier that I don't even know if you deliberately mean to highlight, but I think it's brilliant and it's worth pulling out, and that is this kind of spreadsheet of what does the Republic of Korea contribute that's in the United States' interest goes so far beyond even things that the ROK is doing for that reason. Yeah. The effect can be to assist U.S. allies, partners, regional order and stability, even when it may look to all intents and purposes like, well, that's just a commercial arms sale. Actually, as you noted, it helps undercut the notion that maybe those are countries in Southeast Asia that are ripe for the picking for Beijing.
Yeah, I actually go on a little bit further in that direction, talk about South Korean official development assistance in the region. And it's not done necessarily in coordination with the United States. It's done bilaterally, but it's based on the same development principles. And when it comes to, the United States right now is trying to coordinate resources to send to the region, it's having a difficult time sending, as much as money they can to meet the needs of the region. And South Korea is a really great partner in terms of sending resources to the region. So in my paper, it found from 1988 since democratization to 2017, South Korea has invested a net ODA of $6.2 billion in the region. Compare that to what the United States has invested, which is about $22 billion in the region. And in the past couple of years, the United States, Trump administration has said that we have sent $4.5 billion to Indo-Pacific countries since he came to office. This was in free and open Indo-Pacific report coming out of the State Department. It said $4.5 billion. South Korea in the past couple of years has sent $2.6 billion. So it's pretty comparable for considering its size, and it works towards the same ends. So it's not done in necessarily because the United States is telling it to or something along those lines. It's because it wants to be a responsible actor in the region, and it helps to sort of build the regional order that we're still pursuing.
Yeah, I think what all of us over the years have seen is there is so much synergy and so much complementarity to the kinds of things that the Republic of Korea has done over the years, in part because of its own values, its own interests, but have been, natural partnerships, if you like, and natural complements to the kinds of things the U.S. is doing. So I think but how you put that on a spreadsheet, it has to be one that's, or on YouTube. But General Sharp, I want to turn back to you and maybe ask you to, before I open up to the full audience, to comment on anything you'd like to. But I wanted to return to something that James mentioned, and it's the fact that certainly in South Korea, there's been talk about what is the relationship between this SMA burden sharing, negotiation that's going on, and U.S. forces in Korea and potential withdrawal of some. And clearly, that's also been a topic of some attention here in Washington, where a year or so ago it wasn't related to SMA, but because of concerns about possible directions that the president might go in, a bipartisan resolution by Congress wanting to be consulted if the withdrawal went deep. But we had the president just the other day saying, his mind remains, I'm paraphrasing here, open to the question. So with all that, since you're a commentator now too, I really appreciate your views on whether the current amount and type of U.S. forces on the peninsula are the right amount. You outlined very helpfully in your opening of what they are.
Yeah. So as you look at U.S. forces in Korea, we've been at 28,500 for a while. About the only major adjustment, two major adjustments that have happened that's limited in time over the last decade have been the THAAD battery, which was brought in for a very specific purpose and a very important purpose for missile defense at the upper tier. And not as talked about nearly as much, but I believe very important is during 2017. We really did fill out our ammunition stocks and made sure all of our pre-positioned equipment was up to snuff and really ready to go. And that, again, not much press got to that, but it was a major combat multiplier when the U.S. decided to do that. And so at the same time, over that last decade, look how far South Korea has come, both internally, indigenously developed equipment and that they have bought from the United States. And then weigh that against, the number one, the immediate threat of North Korea, who have greatly advanced in missiles and in nuclear capability, in subs and special operating capability, not reduce their conventional force at all. So I believe, I know that every year during the annual MCM-SCM, there's an analysis that says, okay, do we have about the right troops? What is Korea? What should be Korea being focused on to have the capability to improve the overall alliance defense? And in the OPCON transition discussions, there's discussions about bridging and enduring capabilities. So enduring capabilities are ones the U.S. promises to keep as part of the capability packages that are needed if you have to go to war kind of forever. And then the bridging ones are, we'll provide that until South Korea has acquired those type of capabilities. So that continuing analysis goes on across the board. I'm not going to point to a specific thing as far as, but I do think that continuing analysis should continue to move as we go forward. I think, so that's from a military capability perspective. But from a, I don't know if it's political or perception capability or perspective, any significant change from 28.5 is going to send all kinds of ramification issues, not just in Northeast Asia, but I think in other places around the world. I mean, if it's a reduction, any significant amount, the whole question's about support of U.S. allies, what's the real value of having the United States, should we look to China or other places, that will increase. And I think that needs to be part of the calculus, not just a pure, military tank-to-tank type of things as we go through. And on the other side, I can paint a picture where North Korea goes back to multiple missile launches and all of that. And instead of one THAAD battery, it's several. That would be hard. But you get my point. More missile defense, more things that are going over there, which would also send signals. So the calculation has to be based on all of those factors. I think we do okay, pretty well at the first factors. I think we've done really well at the keeping at 28.5 because of the perception for a while, but I do worry where we are, where President Trump is right now because of some of the things that he said.
Yeah, great, terrific. All right, I'm going to open it up to the floor. If you would like to ask a question, make a comment on something you've heard, please raise your hand. We have microphones. Let's go. Yeah, right over here to Emma. Yeah, hi.
Hi, I'm Emma Chandler, Avery Congressional Research Service. Thank you to the panel. Great discussion, and you're all very disciplined and staying short, which is great. I want to push a little bit further on something that General Sharp just brought up. If the SMA expires, which I think is likely at this point, and North Korea returns to a path of provocations, there could be the effect that the threat perception from the ROCs goes up, and they're encouraged to get to yes with the United States in some way. But on the other side, if we return to some version of fire and fury from Washington, then the threat perception of the United States starting a war on the peninsula also goes up. And that introduces some weird dynamics. Are we going to start paying more to the United States, even though we're concerned that they may be actually the ones that could start some sort of contingency here? Because it seems like President Moon at some point made the calculation that was a threat to him, that the United States rhetoric and possibility of starting some preventative, launching a preventative strike would threaten his country's security. So where does that leave us?
Well, we start with the expert on Korean opinion here.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Emma. So, there are so many things that if you talk about the threat perception, I guess my previous statement on this was, it depends on what kind of threat. It also depends on how you manage that threat, and I guess, it's difficult to say, right? Because there's so many permutations on this that it's difficult to put it in a multiple choice, get a Korean perspective on it. But we did ask about the South Korean support for continued USFK presence on the Korean Peninsula. And that's something we ask every year. In 2017, it was 81% when threat was really high, right? That goes down in 2018 to 76%, 4 or 5% decrease. 2019, it's at 68%. So putting aside the SMA issue, just thinking about USFK, across the board, fairly good support, but when threat perception is low, there's, how should I say this? There's this view that maybe continued USFK presence on the peninsula is not that important as we look to the future when threat perception is low. When threat perception is high, obviously there's a recognition there. It's intuitive, right? But it's still quite high by all standards. It's a supermajority. You got 68%, all right, at its lowest point. So if we go back to provocation cycle next year, I would expect a similar sort of uptick on the Korean views about USFK being a very important thing for them. So even though it was US that was escalating in 2017 and people seemed to pin the blame on President Trump, they did not equate this with USFK, okay, the risk of a US action with the USFK presence. At least not, the data doesn't seem to show it, okay? So there's nothing to suggest for us right now, but there's no reason why we can't try to come up with, a questionnaire survey of some kind if we get into next year where we would be exploring these kinds of questions that you raise. But yeah, it's an unfamiliar territory, but generally speaking, you can come up with these different scenarios that seems to that would get at the kinds of questions you're asking. And frankly, I don't know what the exact answer is, but in 2017, the Korean people or the Korean public didn't seem to equate the rising tensions on the Korean Peninsula due to the buildup by the United States as and the presence of the USFK being part of that. They seem to think about this as somewhat separate things. If not, they seem to think that the USFK, in fact, is there to protect them more so than they are to, cause problems.
Can I just add to that? I mean, you got at some of this. Some of it, I think, depends upon what the character of the raise of the provocations does look like. I mean, you can take one extreme. If it's another Yangpyeong-do, I can tell you what that support would, the support for U.S. troops there and U.S. action and all of that would be very large. If it's a launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile that doesn't obviously threaten South Korea or the region at all, and the U.S. responds, I think our response would mostly be not things coming to Korea, but we would do things missile defense-wise and other things in other places around for intelligence and all of that. So, the 2017 and all the missile launches and all of that, what it resulted in was one THAAD battery. And that's been played in Korea for lots of reasons that I understand as being very difficult in some cases, some because of what China did in response to it and all of that. But I think a lot of it does depend upon what type of provocations as you go forward. The connecting that to the SMA side now of that, so you got provocations moving forward, and as I think you pointed out that, okay, somebody pointed out, what is kind of the U.S. response in all of this to a rising tension? Again, some of that goes back to the type of provocation. I mean, if it's another Yangpyeong-do, that response is South Korean. It's U.S. all about, we have some ISR in there. The immediate self-defense response, as everybody knows, is South Korean. Not only South Korean assets, but South Korean led. But it still does get the perception out there, okay, well, what are these U.S. troops that are doing that? So I think it would become much more difficult and much more complicated than to kind of manage that from the perspective of, well, the U.S. didn't do anything to respond to this. Well, that's not our job to be able to do that at that time. That's long-winded to say it's complicated, as you said, many different factors that have to be put together. But I do see a potential relationship in discussions between, rising tensions, U.S. responses, and then how that, SMA and the question of the support of South Koreans, I think those could very quickly become intertwined.
Yeah, good. I'm going to take a couple of questions here, if we can, and then we'll have a kind of a final comments from our panels in response to the question. So yes, I saw your hand. Yes.
Hi, I'm Soyeon Kim, a reporter from RFA. My questions might be a little similar to what Emma just did. And I understand that the focus today is more like cost sharing, but I want to get a brief thoughts from panels, including Minister Song, regarding the latest provocative, like a back and forth between Trump and Kim, especially today, not long before this event took place. There was a new statement by Choi Sun-hee, and then basically she says that they are not happy with the recent Trump's mentioned comments, and also they also use this insulting word, daughter and things like that. And the media, like a social media, like a public, they are all talking about this, and they say that, the war game started again. They're kind of worried about. So my question is, do you see this just like typical rhetoric by North Korea, or do you kind of see this different? Especially, there is some ultimatum, set by Kim Jong-un, by the end of this year. Thank you.
Okay, we'll gather a couple more, and then I'll leave it to Minister Song whether he wants to make a response at the end or talk to the press afterwards. But okay, I'm going to go over here, and then I'll come to Florence. Try to make your questions fairly brief. Sorry.
Sure. Michael Choi Kim. When I studied in Korea back in 2005 with the flagship program as a fellow. So one of the things I'm very curious about is the Korean voter, actually, and where does this all play in USFK deterring North Korea in terms of their political calculus? Is it their number one priority, or, three economists downgraded Korea's economy when it actually contracted in the first quarter. Are they worried about jobs? Are they worried about economic growth? What's the number one key issue for Korean voters? Thank you.
Okay, Korean voter. Florence. And I'll have to make this the last one.
Florence Lowly, Global America Business Institute. Kyle and Scott, you both talked about spreadsheets. And I think it's an outstanding idea that how it's going to benefit Korea. But is that spreadsheet how Trump came up with that number and the increase?
Okay, all right. So why don't we start with that, the spreadsheet question, and then what is the Korean voter question for? I think that's for you, James, probably, and then any comments on? I'm always getting breaking news from Radio Free Asia from the panel or from Minister Song.
I just say, in the interest of speed, I'll say no.
You'd say no to?
No, it's not how the president, I do not believe, came up with the number $5 billion through deep research and looking at a spreadsheet. That's my guess.
Yeah, I guess I would follow up with that. It seems as if this is something that has been preceding even his time in office. CSAS did this report where he said it 114 times before. It's a very consistent approach taken by the president, but one, I'm not sure, like Scott said, not sure how he got to that number. And I think the more information you can sort of bring in and sort of help to shine light on areas that are being underappreciated can kind of help even the scales a bit. Because as was said before, there is room for South Korea to pay more, but it needs to be done in a more grounded approach.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what came first, the 4.7 or the spreadsheet, but I think they're both out there now. And whether the number came up 5 times and then let's develop a spreadsheet that shows that, or the other way around. But from what I have heard, there is one that has all the different things and more that I'm not aware of that get to that number that the White House is using.
All on the U.S. side.
Yes, exactly. Okay. That's my understanding. Yeah.
And in fact, I've also heard there's actually a report on this in Washington Post. I saw the total cost on the maintenance and the personnel cost adds up to about $4.5 billion. There's a number that the DoD has already presented to Congress for the NDAA round on the budget.
There also there's maybe it's kind of a minor technical point, but I think the SOFA actually stipulates that. The SOFA actually stipulates that SMA should not include personnel costs.
Non-personnel
Right.
station cost. It's what
But,
is
I mean,
what
not,
his,
not,
we
not
historically done.
paying
I don't
the
know what
salaries
specifically.
of,
Right. So
Of
I mean,
service members.
It's, yeah,
right.
service
right.
members
So
and
what
service
that
members.
suggests is that maybe SOFA needs to be reworked.
Well, we have the man for the job right here.
Right, right. You can do that. On the South Korean economy, the South Korean voter on the politics for next year, the number one issue is jobs. Macroeconomic data, well, the number that everybody's converging to for this year is 1.9%. That's within the range that Bank of Korea has already stated. It's in the lower end. But a lot of my friends in Hong Kong and New York tell me they're seeing 1.9 as well. So there's some convergence there, and we'll find out within a month or two what that number is. It's not acceptable for the South Korean voter because they're looking for somewhere between 2 to 3%, and the president promised 3, or somewhere high in the upper 2% area. So politically, he's taking some hits. A lot of people are blaming his economic policies. The 2 consecutive years of double-digit growth on minimum wage, how that's impacted not the big businesses, but actually the small, medium enterprises. Unemployment, though it's under 5% macro, unemployment of youth is at 11, 12%. And that really is hurting the youth voters. And so it's not a really great story on the economic side. It's slowed growth everywhere, but Korea, it seems to be more so. Even though the U.S. stock market is, very vibrant, and the U.S. economy looks relatively good. How is it that our second largest trading partner is prospering so much, but Korea is not doing so well? And a lot of Koreans are asking that question. And so the ruling party has its back against the wall for next year in April election when it comes to the economy, which means that they need some other feel-good story, and they can't have failures. North Korea is obviously one of them, where you're not getting any new developments. So there's frustration there. The Japan issue is also another adding fuel to the fire, and then you got this alliance management issue. So some people call it the perfect storm. I don't know what to call it. It's getting piled on the administration and the ruling party. But one saving grace that they do have here is that the opposition isn't really strong. So they got a weak opposition, so they have some leeway here, some flexibility. And the question is, how quickly can the opposition remake itself before the April election? If it fails to do so, then I think there's a lot of room for failure here for President Moon. But if the opposition looks weak as it does right now, and it continues to do so into April, he's okay. But if opposition looks strong, then he's got to get some wins in these other areas, because we're not seeing any significant movements on the economic side.
So leading just to our last question, I don't know what the latest was, and maybe some do, of what the exchange was between Pyongyang or Chesan-hee and the White House. But maybe just to broaden it, if anyone wants to make a comment, or I don't know if you want to wait till after the session, Minister Song, you're welcome to say something now about this end of year, declared deadline for the U.S. to do something that will make possible diplomacy in 2020, and where that fits into, I guess, threat perception and prospects for the new year. Any volunteers? Sure. Would you mind? Would you? Yeah, sure. We'll let you have the last word. Is that all right? Okay. Just go ahead and then. No, we're done. You have the last word. There you go. That'll work.
Well, it is very much enlightening, and I learned a lot from panels and questions from the floor. Let me just add some comment on this the last exchange of the verbal harsh words between Pyongyang and Washington that happens lately. To my experience, North Korea, we Koreans say that when you pull out your sword from the gauntlet, you have to cut at least the pumpkin. 코리안스는 칼 뽑았으면 호박이라도 자른다. Not the
love Korean phrases.
So that has been kept by North Koreans for many decades. They do. We do not know what would be the nature of that action. But to my observation, North Koreans, particularly Kim Jong-un, might have been feeling that he has been kept in the limbo. He could not move either way by these beautiful letter exchanges with Trump. So North Korea just did some, short and mid-range missile tests, but not go beyond that, and no military provocation towards South. But I think they regard this time is going to the limit because Kim Jong-un has to show something, not to outside the world, but inside North Korea. So we have to be prepared. Any kind of contingencies, we do not know exactly. They are genius in making something that we could not anticipate in advance. That's the point. And secondly, about this the spreadsheet of U.S. forces in Korea. Well, General Sharp, you know much about this the NPSC issue, non-personnel stationing cost of American forces in Korea. If we can work articulately on this issue, we can help solve this problem of cost sharing. But we could not have. When I was in the ministry, actually I asked my negotiator about the exact position of that so that we can first persuade our budget people in the government and Blue House, showing them the exact numbers so that you can have a gradual increase. But problem was we could not get it. And now, about 10 years later, this word, non-personnel stationing cost, disappeared from the negotiation table. I think that's the problem. And one other point of this the cost sharing is many Korean people think that White House and Washington is employing the tactic of so-called in Chinese, the Shiji Jinghu, means killing chicken, scaring monkey. And next year, Washington is facing the negotiation with Japan, and then negotiation with NATO. NATO is almost solved. The NATO is a different kind. This is just how to maintain the NATO headquarters budget, not like Seoul-Washington negotiation. But in this year's negotiation with Seoul will give a great impact on with Japan. So when Koreans feel that we are regarded as a chicken before showing something to the monkey, we feel very much frustrated. That's something Korean people have in mind. And lastly, Scott, you said about this some military cooperation with Korea and other Asian countries in the Indo-Pacific realm. I'm reminded of this. I named it a sort of a Carnegie Endowment formula. It was in 1980s. Carnegie Endowment made a report. That's a simple word. American presence in the region enhances its political influence, thus expand economic opportunities. I don't know whether this formula still prevails. Still, it works. For example, when we import technologies and some licenses from the United States, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, all you big fives, we just develop it and process on our way, and then we have a cooperation with other countries like Indonesia or Philippines, and then the Korean companies pay loyalty to the American companies. I think Washington, the White House should see this bigger spectrum of the military cooperation and security cooperation our countries, not just focusing on the numbers, but unfortunately and sadly, Trump is just focusing on numbers. That's some sad story, but we have to overcome it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if I should say, but this discussion has certainly exceeded my expectations. I've learned a lot, and I really want to thank all of our speakers and our guests for engaging so fully and so thoughtfully. I hope we can continue it. Clearly, there's a lot to talk about and think about as events unfold in the next year. I want to thank our audience very much for being here as well, and see you again soon. Thank you.